Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders. I'm wondering, how are you feeling about your staff at your nonprofit? Do you have your dream team, or is that something you'd like to be in pursuit of? Well, if so, stick with me. Today, we are talking about my three top tips for developing your staff at your organization. And these tips actually work for profits and nonprofits alike. So if you're a for profit person listening in, or maybe you're a for profit person on a nonprofit board, these are going to be for you as well as all my wonderful nonprofit leaders out there. Okay, tip number one for developing your staff, something I call heads versus hands roles. I learned this from an amazing business person. Her name was Shelby, and she's the first one who used this language as I heard it. So, within any of our organizations or businesses, one person may play either a role or a hands role or both. A heads role is a decision making role about things that need to potentially change. And typically, a heads role is having accountability for something that's outside of our direct control. So you might have accountability around increasing the number of donations that come in, right? You don't have direct control over how many donations come in, but being accountable for that is still very important. So, not everybody's up for being a heads role or a heads role. You have to have a certain amount of confidence, expertise, and experience typically to feel comfortable being in the heads role of any particular function of your nonprofit. A hands role is the doing part. And it's not that you don't make decisions. You certainly make decisions about when to do something or, whether or not it's good enough. But the hands is the doing work. So if we're thinking about creating a strategy, a heads role is going to be involved in creating the strategy. If we're talking about implementing the strategy, we're going to have lots of doing in implementing that strategy. Make sense? So, and to be clear, one person can play a heads role in one area in your organization and a hands role in another area. Great example I like to use is an executive director might not be the head of the development office, but they're certainly going to be hands involved, right? Because they're going to need to have conversations and they're like kind of the key spokesperson for the organization. And certainly with major donors, they're going to want to have conversations, but they don't need to necessarily be driving the strategy if there is a development officer or running that part of the organization. Okay, so tip one was identify heads and hands and know when you're doing which. Tip number two is to understand and identify the key functions that are at play in your nonprofit. Now, I don't have time to go into this today, but I have found over the years that every nonprofit has the same basic set of key functions that make that organization run. And, um, and if you want to attend, I give a master class on advanced training on staffing up your organization. And I go into a little more depth into what those functions are. I call it the Nonprofit Leadership Blueprint. I'll put the link in the chat to how to access that afterwards if you're interested. But basically, we have functions about where the organization's going, how well it's running, functions around bringing in money, and functions around running programming. I like to think of those functions and kind of break them up into two categories. We have stabilizing functions, right? Like let's take our resources and make sure we're using them in the best ways possible. Let's make sure that our programs are being carried out in the way that they were designed to be carried out. And so those people who are heads roles in those stabilizing functions are going to be kind of making decisions about how do we kind of keep things the same? How do we keep things consistent? How do we make things efficient? Um, Destabilizing functions, and I mean that in the best way possible. They're actually my favorites as kind of a visionary leader type. If you're a visionary leader type, put visionary in the chat for me or the comments. If you're watching the recording, you thrive with the destabilizing functions. Destabilizing functions are about how we change our organization so that we can move into the future. One of my favorite to introduce to those visionary type nonprofit leaders is the function of making sure that you are going in the right direction. So what's involved with this function? Well, we're going to be thinking like 10 steps ahead, right? What's coming down the pipeline? When do we need to or where do we need to change? What are those relationships we need to start building now because they may have an opportunity for us in the future, or we're going to need them in the future, right? It's really a lot to do this well, is a lot of brain time, a lot of exploring, a lot of networking, a lot of time to just ideate or even go do something fun to release your brain so it can get creative. This is about figuring out the what part of the strategy. What are we going to do? Whereas the stabilizing part of strategy development is often when are we going to do it? When is the right time for us? Um, and that's a really fun destabilizing function. Like, are we going to change direction or not? Some other destabilizing functions are around, do we have the right programming or do we need to be changing our programming? Because the truth is, any system, this is true in nature, any system that stays the same is experiencing entropy, meaning it's losing energy. And so if you're always focused on maintaining consistency and staying the same, ultimately your organization is on a path to fading away, becoming less relevant. And that's not really sustainable. So, to have true sustainability and longevity in our organizations, we need to always be balancing enough stability and consistency that everybody can join the ride, right? Because we're trying to bring a lot of people along. If it's too chaotic, people just kind of like, this is too crazy. I don't know where I belong. And they go off. But we can't be totally consistent and the same because it gets stagnant and boring and we lose energy in our excitement about pursuing our missions and pursuing our strategy. So we also need those destabilizing roles, which are thinking about how we're going to change things up in order to stay present, current, and moving into the future, or even driving our own future forward. Okay, tip number 3 is to open up the advancement process. So what do I mean by this? I mean, rather than, one or two leaders in your organization thinking about, are we just hiring another leadership position or are we going to promote somebody within? I want you to start thinking about how you can get everybody in your organizations having conversations about who could be moving where in your organization, who wants to be shifting, right? Who wants to be shifting into a heads role who hasn't been in a heads role before? Who wants to be shifting, adding a heads role? And what types of roles are those going to be? Destabilizing roles? Are they going to be stabilizing roles? And often, we need to start somewhere. We can just say, like, everybody's involved in the discussion now, and just throw it out there. We have to get used to this process. But my clients who are using the impact method, bit by bit, they take this tool, the nonprofit leadership blueprint, and they use it as a framework, as a visual, because it's actually a visual blueprint, to open up the conversation to their whole team. Where do we want to go as a team? If we think about our team as chess pieces on this chessboard of the leadership blueprint, how might people want to shift over time? And where might our gaps be as a team overall? And if we start having that conversation organization wide, we're creating opportunities for people to evolve. Another key thing about kind of opening up opportunities for our teams to evolve is one thing that's kind of slipping in there really fast is that this idea of having a blueprint of the functions of your organization, it represents a model of distributed leadership and management of outcomes, as opposed to the hierarchical model that most of us have inherited, where people are in charge of people. And when people are in charge of people, right? So if you have a manager or a direct report, you have this system of people in charge of people. It's not really good for innovation. People don't actually love being involved in systems where they have some sort of master or supervisor. And it can also, it does, I shouldn't just say it can, it always makes our system of advancement more prone to the systemic biases and inequities that we all inherit in our brains, whether we like it or not. Because whether or not somebody advances becomes much more dependent on the relatively subjective opinions and views of their supervisor. Whereas if we start thinking about measuring and managing outcomes as opposed to people, we are more, I like to call it, durable or robust against inheriting systemic biases and equities. Certainly they still come in, but we have, this other lens which doesn't really consider our opinions about things, because we're actually able to measure outcomes much more better than we are able to measure people, and with more objectivity than we are able to measure somebody's performance. So those are my tips for you today in developing your staff at your organization. If you would like tips like these in your inbox, go to inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. If you want a lot more support and like, yes, I want to be implementing this blueprint. Yes, I want to be having guidance with Sarah so I can bring my whole team into a new approach. Yes, we want to be more kind of robust against inheriting these systemic biases and equities, also known as DEI work. But I think there's two ways to think about that. And evolving our organization. If this sounds exciting to you, I encourage you to consider the Thrive program. And the first step in that is simply to go to pivotground.com/application. You'll submit an application. I review it manually. I'll see if it seems like you're a good potential fit. And if so, we'll have a meeting. I'll send you more information. And the Thrive program is where I help organizations go through this transformation, start using the impact method. And there's lots of coaching and support and a great community for organizations who really want to level up their ability to make an impact. That's all I have for you today. It is such a pleasure to come to you every week. And I will see you next week with a new tip about a new topic for nonprofit leaders. Until then.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.